I used to live with a buddy I'll call Jake in a tiny house for a few years while we were in college. We were roommates for the first year, but then we decided to move out of the dorms and share a house since we both had decent jobs. This was our first time renting, so we didn't know much about budgeting. A few months passed and everything seemed fine, but almost a year later, we realized our bank accounts were hurting because of the rent. We had two choices: leave the house or find a new roommate. We didn't want to leave, so we started looking for a roommate. We asked our other friends, but none were interested, so we had to post online. I put a post on Facebook Marketplace, and Jake put one on Craigslist. It felt weird, but we had no choice. A few weeks passed with just a few responses, none serious. Then Jake got an email from someone named Mark in response to his Craigslist post. Mark seemed legit, and the next day, he came to see the house. He was a bit older and just graduated, but he looked clean and nice. We were happy to have him. He agreed to share the rent and moved in a week later. For a few months, Mark hung out with us, and we got to know him. But suddenly, he became very quiet. We hardly saw him, and when we did, he wouldn't talk. He stayed in his room most of the time, only coming out for food or work. It didn't bother me much, but it was strange. About 4 months after Mark moved in, things took a turn for the worse. I came home from work, and Jake quietly called my name from the living room. He said Mark was home, so we shouldn't talk too loudly. Then he told me about a strong smell near Mark's room. I hadn't noticed it, so he told me to walk past Mark's door quietly and see if I smelled it. I didn't have to get close. The smell was awful and disgusting. I didn't know what it was, and I'd never smelled it before in the house. Jake suggested we ask Mark, and I agreed. We went to Mark's door, knocking and calling out to him, but he didn't answer. We were sure he was inside, but he didn't respond. After a few minutes, we gave up and decided to ask him the next day. It was late by then, so we made dinner and watched TV in the living room before going to bed. The next day, I asked Mark about the smell when he was leaving for work. He said, "I was just taking out the trash," and quickly left. His answer didn't make sense, but I didn't press him further. I told Jake, and he thought it was weird too, but we left it at that. A couple more weeks passed, and Sam barely talked to us, but the smell had disappeared. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night hearing movement from downstairs, where Mark's room was. I listened for a while, but went back to sleep. The next morning, Mark didn't return home, and we couldn't reach him by phone. We got worried and checked his room for clues. It looked like he'd packed up and left. We found some glasses in his drawer, even though Mark didn't wear glasses. He'd left clothes and furniture behind, so it didn't seem like he moved out suddenly. Jake called the police to report Mark missing, and an officer came to ask us questions. We told him everything and let him see Mark's room. We also gave the officer a picture we took with Mark when he moved in. A week later, a different detective called us. They said the man in the picture wasn't Mark, but a missing person. It was someone's son who had been gone for almost a year. The case became complicated, and we lost contact with the police. We never saw that man again, and I don't know if he was ever found. Knowing that I lived in the same house as someone with a fake identity and a mysterious past gives me chills every time I think about it. It's hard not to assume that he was hiding from the police for something he had done or was still doing. It was around 2017. I was looking for a new house to start a fresh chapter in my life. My mom found an ad on the internet, and it was a house that came with the basic things we needed. The person who owned the house was a man, and he said there was an empty room upstairs that I could rent. The ad also mentioned that some other girls were living in the rooms upstairs, and he didn't want to rent to guys because of their wild parties and bad behavior. It sounded good to me, and it was also the cheapest option in the area. So I decided to go check it out. I arrived at the house around 2 in the afternoon. It was a decent house in a nice neighborhood. I rang the doorbell and waited. Soon I heard footsteps, and a man in his late 40s opened the door. He had a smile on his face and greeted me warmly. The inside of the house didn't look too bad. The floors were clean, and a big chandelier hanging from the ceiling lit up the place nicely. On my left, there was a big wooden staircase leading upstairs. I asked the man how many girls were living there, and he rubbed his hands together as if he was thinking. Then he said, just 2 for now. They're out working." I nodded and asked if I could see the room. He said, "Yes, of course. Follow me." He walked towards the staircase to go up, but instead of going upstairs like I expected, he opened another door, and I followed him. We went down a long, narrow hallway that led to a small room. This room was strange. It had no closet, no windows, and the door was broken. He told me this was the room I would be renting, and I would share a bathroom in the hallway with him. Strangely, his own bedroom didn't have a door. I knew something was very off about this guy at this point. He was acting suspicious and asking me to stay in a room with a broken door while sharing a bathroom right next to his doorless bedroom. He then took me upstairs to show me the other rooms. The stairs creaked loudly as we stepped on them. There were 2 rooms side by side, and their doors were wide open. He claimed they were rented, but I had my doubts. No one would leave their room open like that unless they trusted someone a lot. When I entered one of the rooms, I was surprised. There was furniture, but nothing in there looked like it belonged to a woman. There were no mirrors, no clothes, nothing that indicated a woman lived there. Instead, I saw men's clothes in one of the closets. It made no sense to me, and he had no problem with me going through the tenant's room without their permission. Something inside me told me I needed to get out of there immediately. As I turned around to leave, I saw the man blocking the doorway, and he had a creepy smile on his face. He said, "I can show you the basement. We have a pool table down there." I felt a shiver down my spine, but I spoke calmly. "Maybe some other time. I don't want to keep my mom waiting. She's outside." Hearing that I didn't come alone, his face turned pale, and he quickly moved out of my way, saying, "Okay, let me know when you want to move in." I rushed down the stairs and ran out of the house as fast as I could. I told my mom everything, and she praised me for being smart and cautious. She told me to report the ad on the internet right away to protect other girls from falling into the same trap. However, when I checked the site to report the ad, it was gone. It had disappeared from the internet. We reported the guy to the police, but they said there wasn't enough evidence to make an arrest. To this day, I'm scared when I think about how that man wanted to show me the basement. I can't help but wonder what he had planned for me. This happened almost 10 years ago when I was 26. It was a tough time in my life, probably the toughest. I had just gotten out of a really bad relationship, and I didn't have a place to live. I couldn't afford anything fancy or even decent on my own. So, I turned to an online platform to find some housing options. It didn't take long before I stumbled upon a listing for a room for rent in the city. The pictures looked nice, and the price was within my budget. I arranged to meet with the person who posted the ad. Her name was Emily, and she was 30 years old, just like me. It seemed like a good match on paper. When I arrived at the apartment, I was greeted by Emily, who was the current tenant and would be my roommate. She was friendly and gave me a tour of the place. The apartment was a decent size, and the room was spacious enough for me. It was clean and well organized. The building itself seemed a bit old and worn down, but the apartment had been nicely renovated. It had the feel of a luxury condo, although you couldn't tell from the outside. The rent was affordable and the location was perfect for my job. I decided to take the room. I moved in the following day after work, eager to have a place of my own. For a few weeks, everything was great. Emily turned out to be an excellent roommate, always up for a friendly chat. We had a lot in common and quickly became good friends. However, things started to take a strange turn when Emily's boyfriend, Mark, began showing up more often. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was friendly and would engage in casual conversation from time to time. But as time passed, I began to notice that he would flirt with me when Emily wasn't around. It made me uncomfortable, and I tried to keep my distance. I thought about talking to Emily about it, hoping she could help, but I decided against it, hoping it was just a passing phase. One night, when Emily was out with friends, Mark came over to the apartment. I was watching TV in the living room when he came in and sat down next to me. He started making small talk, and then he leaned in and kissed me on the cheek. I pushed him away and told him to leave me alone. He got up and went to Emily's room. Another time, in the morning while I was cooking breakfast in the kitchen, he came in and started flirting with me again. Suddenly, Emily walked in and saw what was happening. She was furious and started screaming at Mark. Then she turned her anger towards me and accused me of leading him on. I was stunned and didn't know what to say. Before I could react, Emily lunged at me, and we started fighting. I tried to defend myself, but I was no match for her. Eventually, we were both exhausted, and Mark pulled us apart. I was hurt and bleeding, and Emily was seething with anger. Mark suggested that we go to the hospital and get checked out. We all piled into the car, and it was an awkward drive with no one saying a word. At the hospital, a doctor examined us both. Emily had a few scratches, but I had a black eye, a split lip, and a bump on my head. The doctor asked what happened, but we lied and said that we fell. I was afraid that involving the police would make things worse, and the doctor seemed to know we weren't telling the truth but didn't press further. After leaving the hospital, Emily and I didn't talk much. The tension in the air was thick, and I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The next day, I packed my bags and moved out. I didn't want to cause any more trouble, and I needed to put that whole incident behind me. I realized I should have been more cautious, more aware of Mark's behavior, and I should have spoken to Emily sooner. Now I have my own place, and I'm working through my emotions with a therapist. The incident with Emily and Mark will always be a part of my past, but I've moved past it, and it's behind me now.